Hey YouTube, Poops like here, and this is TurboFat, an open source puzzle game I'm making in Godot. Source code's linked below if you want to see how it all works, but for the past 2 months I've been polishing up the game for its October release. And that means fixing up the UI and making it look more like a game, brushing up the gamepad support so you can get through all the menus and gameplay and stuff without having to use the mouse and keyboard, and pulling out a few things that aren't going to make the cut. So let me show you what I've been doing. So I originally planned for this game to have 7 areas, including this robot-themed Vega Turn 12 area, but I'm out of time, so I pulled all the levels that were in this area and moved them around into the easier areas. But in doing so, I wanted to make sure they sort of fit the theme and the difficulty. So for example, this strawberry slow cake level used to be a little more challenging, but I made it easier and added some sharks to it, so when I pushed it into the Pokey Desert, it sort of fits with the theme and the difficulty of that area. And I had to make similar changes to the other like 20 or 30 levels in this area when I pushed them out, but that's all done. So the UI for the main menu had these drab gray buttons, and I wanted to dress those up a little. So I drew up a proof of concept for these colorful textured buttons where each button has like an O piece or a Q piece tiled, so it sort of ties into the game's aesthetic a little better. And I wanted to also have these accents behind the titles, so it just looked a little bit more interesting than boring text. And lastly, a white outline which connected to these character graphics on the outside because I think the character graphics are one of the most appealing things about the game. So I wanted to hook those into the menus a little. So I first drew and designed these colorful buttons I call candy buttons, which have a bunch of different color and texture options. For the textures, I just drew a bunch of different button textures based on the pieces in the game. So there's like a repeating Q piece texture and stuff. And those are all just different images. But I didn't want to do that for the colors because the number of combinations is staggering. So the colors are handled with the gradient map. And there's different gradient maps for things like, oh, the red button, and if it's hovered, there's a slightly brighter gradient map. And then when it's focused, there's this bright blue gradient map to make it look really eye-catching and like, oh, that's what's selected. The buttons also let you pick icons, so you can have things like a settings button with a wrench icon that's got this pretty outline and it looks pretty good. And then lastly, for the accents behind like titles like main menu and play and stuff, I want to have these little splashy graphics behind them. So those graphics change height based on the font you pick, and they change width at runtime based on the length of the word because the German word for like game start might be 200 characters long. You don't know, so it'll pick different graphics at runtime. And I think the result looks pretty good though if you look at the old and the new. The one thing I didn't really get to is having the creature graphics in the corner like in my proof of concept. It's because right now all these different menus are different scenes, and persisting things like that, like the creatures who can like turn their head and giggle or whatever between scenes, was going to be a big headache. So for now those aren't in, but maybe someday. So in the interest of tackling the hardest problems first, the settings menu has the most complicated UI of anything in the game with all these different tabs and radio buttons and drop downs and checkboxes and all this weird stuff. So I wanted to tackle that before it got too scary later. I drew a bunch of proofs of concept for how it might look when it's done. I played with different things like how the volume sliders might look or the little vertical scroll bar, how check buttons might look and whether buttons would be like raised and lowered versus just being flat, and how things would look when they're focused. Like if you click it and then you want to use the arrow keys, how do you know what the arrow key is going to do? So I pitched this all to my Discord and they gave me some good feedback. So here's the resulting UI widgets I came up with. Godot's UI is heavily customizable, but there are a few things that it doesn't quite like to do. For example, these vertical scroll bars, I wanted to have this grabber be wider than the slider track it's on, but you can't do that. What you can do though is make the slider track it's on use a graphic that has a lot of transparent space on the sides. That way it looks narrower. So that was an easy workaround. The hard one was these buttons that raise and lower as you press them, because Godot likes having a focus graphic which goes over top of a button when it's focused. And if the button is like raising and lowering, then this focus graphic would have to move too, or it looks strange. So I couldn't find a workaround for that. Instead, I have a node which hangs off of the button, and then as you press and raise the button, it swaps in all the graphics it needs to swap in so that the focus looks all right. That's not great. And after I finished all this UI work, I did look online and I found this simple box GUI UI for Godot. I don't know if that's Godot 3 or Godot 4, but I think it's Godot 3, and it found some way to do the same visual effect. I'm assuming without this ugly kludge that I came up with. So I'm going to look into that and see if it's better. And honestly, I might just swap my stuff out for theirs because it looks a little better too. So the next biggest, most intimidating problem left in my game was the creature editor. The UI for this was, first of all, very mouse and keyboard centric. You had to like click these creature portraits on the left to do a lot of things. It was also all in a scroll pane with a tab pane, so you couldn't really use the gamepad very well, and it just needed to be redesigned to be simpler and support gamepads. So I had a few ideas. This first version is where there's a bunch of categories on the left, which is vertically stacked up, and you click one, like eyes, and then a bunch of eye graphics pop out. The next was this wheel-based approach. I thought maybe you have like the portrait, and here's all the things you can change. Then you pick one, and the guy lifts off to the side, and here's all the things you can do. Here's all the eyes you can pick, or whatever. The next approach is a step-by-step approach like the Me Creator, where you're like, pick your eyes, pick your mouth, pick your nose, what color do you like? That made sense to me too. And then this fourth version was like a grid-based approach where there's just a big grid of categories, and maybe you click one, and then the rest of the grid goes away, and it's like, well, here's all the eyes for the category you picked or whatever. I solicited feedback, and people gave me a lot of good ideas and good feedback. The most important being like with the third approach, the step-by-step approach, it would be better if you could see all the categories at once. And I thought about how that might work, and I came up with some cool stuff. So here's the newly redesigned creature editor. It has these category buttons up top, which shrink and grow as you select them. That way they all fit on screen. And then this label below them shows you what you've selected. That way the text doesn't have to be on the button itself. I also have the parts on the left and the colors on the right, and they interact. So if you pick eyes that do not have a color, those color buttons disable, so you don't try to pick the color of something that doesn't actually have a visual effect. Also, creature parts will now disable if there's a conflicting creature part. So if you pick like a nose and then you go to the mouths, it'll be like you can pick any of them, but you can't pick this beak because you got a nose and it wouldn't fit. The focus of Godot was a little bit of a hurdle. Like by default, if you pick a button and then you try to arrow left from that button, Godot will assign focus to the nearest neighbor, which in this case was always going up to the categories. So then it would change your category and you couldn't pick certain creature parts. So the way I worked around that was making a focus coordinator script. And what this guy does is you give it a whole bunch of nodes, and it'll assign their focus neighbors within themselves according to this algorithm where it first looks directly left from a node, for example. And if it can't find a node there, then it'll look diagonally left. And then if it can't find a node there, then it'll assign the focus neighbor to itself. But it assigns focus neighbors in all four directions just based on that algorithm. And then with a little bit of extra logic for assigning, like, oh, if you go up from the creature parts, then that'll go up to the category and things like that. But overall, with that one node I made, that one script, everything became a lot simpler. And the new UI works great, except it is missing a little functionality from the old stuff. There used to be a lot of very detailed randomization stuff that I don't think most people will want. Most people just want the sliders. But I did like the idea of saying, like, oh, I like my creature, but I want something like 10% different. Or I like the nose, but change everything else. Or I just want to see different mouths. So, that stuff's not around anymore, but hopefully people won't miss it. So lastly, Hish of the TurboFat Discord ended up localizing the entire game into Spanish. That's all 6 chapters, every joke, every cutscene, every tutorial message, every level name, just everything. It's insane. 13,861 words. So I can't thank them enough. If you end up playing the game in Spanish, make sure to throw them a thank you as well. So that's where we're at after May and June. We've got a lot of the UI redesign, including like the main menu, the settings menu, and the creature editor, all been totally redesigned. They look great. The level editor would be the next big one, but it's so big, I'm just going to have to pull it out of the game and maybe bring it back after the game's released if there's demand. Sadly, it's just what's there already is kind of complex to think about how to do with a controller, and it's missing like 90% of the functionality for all the weird gimmicks you can add and stuff. So maybe someday. But in the meantime, the advantage of tackling all this big, scary stuff first is the small stuff is what's left. So, like, the color picker in the creature editor is using the default Godot widget, which doesn't work well with the gamepad. There's no on-screen keyboard for entering things like your name, and I'd like to add that. I'd also like to think about adding a demo so people can try out the game without buying it, because I think it has some cool mechanics that don't really show off when you're just, like, looking at a trailer. Anyways, in the meantime, if you want to wishlist the game, it is on Steam. And otherwise, I'll just see you guys next month. Thanks so much for tuning in. Take it easy.